Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey to the banks of the Nile, to step into the sandals of a pharaoh in ancient Egypt. Imagine the dawn breaking over Thebes, the smell of incense in temple halls, and the weight of Ma'at, the balance of order and justice, resting on your shoulders. A life of power, yes, but also of endless duty, war, and the hope of leaving a legacy carved in stone. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what other period of history you would like to experience. Now raise the crown high, the halls of the Pharaoh await. Chapter 1. Dawn in Thebes. Our story begins in Thebes. Imagine you are the Pharaoh in the year 1274 BCE. Courtyards open toward Karnak, while attendants set pallets in order, their movements familiar and assured. The Kopresh would later go to a field of chariots and wheels, where decisions would be carried past river mouths, and princes would learn the edges of command. But for now, the palace breathed in measured tasks and simple gestures, and the halls waited for the first names to be spoken. The morning was arranged by habit, each step set down well before a scribe ever learned to ink a title. Schedules had been marked in the hands of others who rose before the sun, and doors had been checked, banners arranged, petitions stacked, and offerings counted. The office of rule wrapped itself not only in power but in order, and the first hours belonged to that order. Ceremonial items stood ready, not yet summoned to their full meaning, hanging in place as the palace minds approached their stations. Beneath the body that had been raised onto the platform, the cool stone floor eased the souls. The first rites of the day were carried in stately simplicity, for a king's beginnings needed no trumpet to be firm. The attendants moved with steady pace, and the basin was presented, clean towels lifted, and garments folded so that nothing interfered with the line of duty. Names and cartridges were present in quiet objects, not in thunder, and the faces of those in service remained composed as their tasks were done in the correct order. Customs governed how the headcloth was set, how a greeting was returned, how the first words were received. The scribes waited just out of reach, tablets at the ready, inks mixed, the assured rhythm of bureaucracy already taking shape. There had been no haste because the palace kept its own pace and expected others to match it. The day was a sequence rather than a rush, and each sequence reflected the crown that guided it. A slender jar opened, and the aroma of cedar oil rose and then settled. Petitions arrived with guards who knew the rules, their presence an old agreement between power and those who stood near it. The first scroll came from a steward reporting the state of work gangs upriver, the second from a chief herdsman who asked for an exchange of land to follow the water, and the third from a captain whose men had finished a posting before the proper time. The court had not yet filled, but a vizier's seat waited at a respectful distance, ready to take on the day's sums, and the chief steward of grain knew how to pace the flow so that the crown's time was not roused to annoyance. There were simple suits about borders between farmers, and longer statements about inheritance, and the knowledge that each line had implications beyond the ink. The discipline of rule was not grand in these hours. It was careful. The formal seal case was brought forward only when the chain of custody had been verified and witnesses were present to mark the moment. The pharaoh's glance prompted a scribe to read one entry aloud and set another aside, and older counselors waited without interruption, aware that the day's shape depended on the steady handling of small matters. When the seal was finally pressed, the cold weight of a ring settled onto the thumb and lifted again. Training grounds lay close enough to be reached without display, a place where practice did not become spectacle, and where mistakes could be corrected without rumor. Chariot frames were inspected for tightness at the joins, axles checked, and the count of spare linchpins matched against the tally in the store. Horses were reviewed by an officer who knew bloodlines and knew how to phrase a report so that praise and caution both held their place. The harness was looked over by hands that understood oil and wear, and the driver's platform was a simple board where confidence steadied in measured circuits. The commander of the bodyguard spoke of rotations and route planning, and maps were sketched from memory onto sand to discuss timing for movements that would be needed later in the season. Practice taught calm. When a bow was strung for the demonstration of form, the tension of the string pressed against the fingers and then released cleanly. Court poets maintained the stories of divine lineage and unfailing victory, and those stories served as a kind of shield that allowed the state to move without fear. But reality leaned on verifying stores, correcting accounts, and interpreting the terms of past decrees. Children imagined that a crown solved every dispute, while counselors understood that a crown fixed attention without simplifying the decision. The palace maintained a model of itself with every transaction, a model that had to fit the river, the fields, and the people who turned those fields into sustenance. Ritual would be needed to keep that model aligned, and debate would be needed to keep ritual from hollowing out. Bearing had its own labor, just as lifting had its own method. Pride came less from display and more from pacing the day so that nothing fell out of its place. During a brief pause before the audience of officials, the taste of dense bread grounded thought between matters of state. Before the noon hour, the procession of officials began, and not one of them arrived without a plan to be noticed, and yet not to overreach. Ranks spoke through where each person stood, and petitions unfolded in practiced steps, each address framed by courtesy that could still cut if needed. A prince by marriage accepted the distance owed to him. A chief of a border district presented a ledger, open to a page whose script had been chosen for clarity, and foreign envoys waited for a signal from a chamberlain who knew how long to make them wait. Habit prevented waste, and the crown leaned on that habit to turn duty into agreement. The audience chamber shaped voices into straightforward lines, and the afternoon's beginning rested on what had been set during the first hours. When a signal was given to approach, the soft drip of water from the clock behind the dais counted the start of serious business. Chapter 2. The Weight of Might. A circuit through the inner palace had been made in the first hours of rule, when doors were unbarred and the thresholds received the procession of attendants. The long gallery past the audience court offered the nearest path to duty. The wasp scepter balanced in the right hand as a staff of steadiness rather than menace, its forked tip a reminder that order touched every track where feet passed. Ahead, the vizier had reviewed lists from the granaries, and the columns of figures tied to fields north and south moved under his guiding finger. Baskets of clay tags waited with impressions made on earlier reigns, and tablet after tablet told of cattle, barley, and labor days counted and owed. In that paced walk, the thought of Ma'at did not rise as a shout. It settled as a rule against which lines were drawn and checked. The first act before petitions had been an offering, a small affirming gesture before the names of honored ancestors on the limestone wall. From a censer at the threshold, frankincense hung sweet in the air, and a deliberate pause was observed. A comrade beside had kept a respectful distance, and the steward kept pace to either side with the day's order of business bundled in linen. The palace complied with the calendar and spoke through appointments, seals, and voices that expected judgment, and the morning began to accept the scale and the feather as more than carving. Past the record chamber, measurements and oaths had been considered as if they were stones set in a straight line. Grain counts from provincial estates arrived tied by string, with the vizier's seal catching the light and the arithmetic beneath it presenting cause and answer. The wasp scepter had been carried not as finery, but as the visible line of Ma'at in the palm, and the old sayings regarding kingship had repeated privately. A ruler was not owner of the land, so much as guardian of its measures. Few words were given to these sentiments. Duty moved forward in assignments and acknowledgements rather than in speech. Officials from the cattle ranges and irrigation crews laid out their reports in proper sequence, and disputes over arrears were flagged for later judgment. Inwardly, it was known that each recalculated total would draw unseen lines toward fields and households in places never visited. The staff's shaft had pressed into the skin with familiar insistence, and its weight had been a reminder that gestures could not be empty when the year's food and labor depended upon them. The council understood without prompting, and records proceeded beneath steady hands. The public face of rule was maintained, yet within it there rested the private learning of how to balance mercy with schedule, gifts with duty, and favor with the calendar's unbending march. At the small chapel kept within the palace enclosure, Ma'at had been affirmed with offerings that were no grand spectacle but a steady custom. Bread loaves and clear water were placed before the symbol of truth, and a priest of quiet habit moved with practiced economy. The rite did not require a crowd or proclamation, it required care. There the thought returned that myth had taught a straight path and reality offered edges, and that a throne made one both sign and servant. A figure of the goddess, small and formal, was set so that the feather would regard the king every day one entered. Petitioners waited at a distance, not yet admitted, while offerings made room for judgment to follow. Hands had moved in agreement with old patterns: pour, set, uplift, still, and withdraw. In the soft hush of ceremony, the only note to mark time had been the low chant of an officiant who kept it slow, even, and familiar. The vizier and steward had stood aside without impatience. Their tasks were bound to what was remembered in this place, even if they used numbers rather than gestures. When the rite concluded, a nod set the next acts in motion, and footprints turned back toward the offices that would convert piety into distribution and ritual into allotment. The hearing bench had then seen the first disputes of the day, with farmers and boatmen presenting cases as if the fields themselves had developed tempers. Two brothers brought a quarrel over a silted boundary where a channel had shifted. An overseer alleged that a crewman had abandoned a duty boat during last season's choke of weeds. Witnesses were called and sworn appropriately, and the vizier arranged the sequence so that each voice would reach the bench without distortion. Martet here required not thunder, but patience. Lines were drawn on a plan, distances compared, and assignments proposed that would repair rather than punish, where repair sufficed. The phrases of judgment were shaped with care so they could be copied, understood, and remembered by those who might never see the palace walls again. Scribes recorded as decisions were concluded, marking names, lands, and compensations under headings that had been used for generations. The wide room contained its own rhythm of appeals granted, remanded, or denied, and by the end a clearer outline replaced argument. The only sound that pressed into the moment was the scratch of a reed pen dragging over papyrus, each time a conclusion made itself firm. After the final case was sent to the steward for execution, the bench was cleared, and the day turned toward management of stores. In the granary court, tall bins had loomed like precinct walls of a different order, and tallies were consulted until their logic confirmed last season's skill. The river had left gifts and demands in equal parts, and so remissions and levies were balanced with care. It fell to the center to keep corners of the land from starving one another. Food to garrisons, bread to the households of workers, and grain to the temples that kept calendars alive. These were not gifts but arrangements linking trust and work. Pledges made to widows and veterans were honored in turn, not for pity but for balance. Written orders went outward with guards and carts, while old sacks were inspected to ensure promise matched practice. A steward proposed a reserve to be held back against pests and bad guesses, and the vizier agreed. Labor demands were measured to days and names, and changes made against weather and need. In that open court, the air remained still and temperate, and the relief of shade along the colonnade had made the scheduling slower, steadier, and less troubled by hurry. Mat here meant moving resources where they belonged, and preventing wealth from hiding where it did not. By the time the last bin had been checked, the court's accounting matched the scribe's tables, and a sign was given to distribute. The council chamber admitted a chain of practical affairs that stitched garrison, shipyard, village, and marsh into something like a map. Reports from frontier storehouses named outposts by distance and road days. Petitions from herdsmen described losses and remedies. Temple gardeners requested seed for restoration of plots flooded too early. The vizier parceled the business. What must be done that hour? What could wait 3 days? And what required a name written large beside the king's? The army's officers reported no crisis, only regular requisitions that kept chariot teams and their drivers provisioned rather than idle. Mart in this context meant that honor rested on tables, carts, and schedules rather than on sudden shows. Most of the work was less visible than duty on the river or in a parade. It amounted to listening, deciding, ordering, and confirming. The discipline of the place asserted itself without threat, because every person present understood that chaos would simply waste later effort. Messengers went out with tablets tucked in belts, and deputy officials took copies for their overseers. The single note that marked progress and kept minds collected was the measured clack of counters moved on a board while a difficult sequence of supplies was reasoned through its steps. With that settled, attention returned to more distant obligations that a ruler could not ignore for long. By late day, another round of offerings had been sent, not to ask for victory or floods, but to mark tasks completed in the spirit they required. Letters had been dictated to foremen, to governors, and to heads of households who expected the crown to remember names and events beyond the river's reach. A brief time was granted to sit before day's last audiences, and instructions were repeated for the morrow's inspections in the workshops that provided walls, tools, and tomb furniture. Advice from older counselors carried a familiar thread. Certainty was less useful than steadiness. Complex matters were left to rest rather than forced to bow. The vizier approved the keeping of a small reserve against rumor and play, and the steward bundled receipts for storage. In that calmer hour, an incense brazier had been set aside, no longer needed to sanctify judgment, only to settle the mind into the evening's account. The one image that fixed itself on the room was a thin thread of smoke that rose without wobble from the ember bed and straightened as if obeying an invisible line. Words resumed after the pause, and tasks found their closings where they could. When the lamps were checked, it became clear what remained and what could pass into the next day without harm. At the records table, seals had been pressed onto strings, and copies were made for distant eyes that would ask for proof when a cart's wheel splintered or a harvest estimate came wrong. A day like this taught more through repetition than through any single announcement. The notion that a crown created obedience simply by being worn proved thinner than stories ever allowed. It was constant measurement of mat in long columns and short judgments that held the country in its path. A line or two had been added in the private book kept for reflection, not for show. A memory of the first disputes heard, a note on a steward's reliable care, and a reminder to visit the work crews whose skills made monuments truthful. The vizier was released for the night, the last petitioner dismissed with an explanation that did not bruise pride, and a guard captain assigned a task for the morning's guard rotation. All of that made a shape that the court could see and follow. The day, heavy at its start, had unfolded into something bearable because pattern replaced noise. The tactility that marked the final closure was simple and grounding, for the grain of clay under the thumb as a seal took its imprint, assured that an order had become a promise, and that promise would move outward before sunrise. Chapter 3. House of Builders. Deir el-Medina rested on the desert's slope where the valley narrowed, and labor had been divided before sunrise into gangs that answered to a foreman and his scribe. Quarry marks were read aloud, names of rooms and shafts spoken as if the stone already held walls, and a register of days and tools passed hand to hand. A pyramidion for a small shrine had been scheduled to receive its gilding, and teams had drawn lots for who would guide the sledges and who would mix the size. Overseers checked attendance by household, because order began with the village roster and only then moved outward to rock and temple. The ledger of rations lay open to its first column, and a messenger waited with a sealed note for the cutting yard. Beyond the houses, the cutting teams fell into rhythm and answered the foreman's count with steady labor, their duties set into the schedule by decree. From where the path rose toward the ridge, the rasp of a copper chisel carried from a cutting yard, a dry, even scrape that measured out the hours as surely as a shadow's crawl. Under that cadence, decisions were made with the patience of masonry and the small audacities of correction. Orders traveled on narrow strips where lines of black script guided stone and men alike, and the seal ring pressed a name into a dab of clay to fix intention. A scribe sat on a low stool and took down the foreman's report. Next shipment due from the quarries, next set of wedges, next exchange of workers between shafts to spread skill. The papyrus bore the names of rooms, lengths for beams, the slope chosen for a casing, and who had been marked absent or ill. Runners moved between village and yard, taking the packets in turns along paths they knew by habit more than thought, and a steward stood ready to dispatch a second note if delay threatened the sequence. At the door, an older artisan asked for an audience to appeal a damaged chisel, and the foreman deferred to the rollover of schedules that had already been inscribed. On the scribe's board, the ink gleamed freshly black as it laid down the day's lines, and that brief shine felt like certainty in an undertaking that always dared the unshaped stone. With the orders wrapped and tied, the runner bowed and peeled away toward the ridge without ceremony. At the cutting face, a foreman set a line with a surveyor's calm, and the stone accepted the rule of numbers that had been inherited from ancestors. A guide marked off length and rise, speaking in quiet phrases as if reminding the rock of a promise, and the team waited on his raised hand before striking. The appointed measurements had been lifted from drawings and given to the gang in terms they used without doubt, because this was how hallways and lintels had kept their duties season after season. The block to be freed would travel to the yard where its edges would be dressed, and only then would the carvers pass it to those who saw form in the mass. In that measured progress, the common world and the ceremonial world held each other up. The cubit rod was taken out of its leather case, and its marks were kissed by numbers and names that only the trained read, yet everyone understood the authority that simple stick carried. A line of red was snapped across pale limestone and shone clear against the face, a frank streak that left no room for argument and asked for a steady hand more than strength. Tools followed the line, and patience stayed just behind them. The pyramidion waited in the workshop where a small hearth sent up a wavering thread, and the gilder set his implements in a row that told their own story of sequence. The wooden core had been smoothed and primed, and a bed of size had been brushed in careful strokes, laid to receive leaf that would magnify light for a shrine that needed no words to speak. Apprentices checked the corners and the intersection of faces, because even a narrow fault could teach the sun to find a mistake, and an older hand corrected a seam with a gesture that owed more to habit than thought. A burnisher lay ready, and a cushion held a stack of foil so thin it clung to a breath, and the gilder waited for the proper moment when adhesion would meet calm nerves. The moment came on the rhythm of the day, not on impatience. A thin smell of heated glue drifted from the brazier and lingered just enough to mark the task as underway without drawing the mind from the work. Under that trace, leaf settled and took the press of the tool, and a shine like water began to collect along the edges. Nothing hurried and nothing slept in that room. Across the village, lists were checked and homes were counted by door, because absence and illness could buckle a schedule faster than a rockfall. Children carried jars and watched the scribes as if letters might be caught like birds, and two older workers argued over who ought to lead the sledge when the day's pull resumed. Those who worked the paint stayed in their own yard and traced figures on shards to test a hand before it met a wall, because practice was a duty that the foreman never wrote down. In a cool storeroom, baskets waited to be weighed and portioned, and the steward read the rations in a voice that had weighed the same words many times. An afternoon list planned when the shrine would receive its small cap, and who would carry it, and which path to the temple would be closed to keep the process clean. A chipped ostracon held a rehearsal of a doorway in red and black, and the trial lines trimmed mistakes that the finished version would never show. Along the hard path between house and yard, gravel crunched under sandals in a slow, even answer to the day's list, a simple sound that ordered feet before the mind joined its rule. In the plain rhythm, the village held together. Beyond the walls, sledges took the load, and men in pairs set their hands to rope, while an overseer matched each team to its station. The ground masters kept the track level and set their buckets to work where friction needed minding, and the wedgemen stood ready to nudge the sled when a ridge showed its stubbornness. Songs had their place, but duty owned the tempo, and the count led the effort rather than the chorus. A guard walked the flanks to keep children away from danger, and to keep the line unbroken by curiosity or pride, because even triumph tripped over a stray foot now and then. The sled advanced in a patient dance between pull and pause, and the team altered their stance on the overseer's stick, each tilt a command from experience more than rank. The block took the path already proved by earlier days, and a runner moved ahead to clear any snare that time might have set. The rough rope ground into palms with a steady bite, a pressure that marked out labor as surely as any tally on a board, and yet it belonged to a pride that did not require speech. When the sled slipped into the yard, it felt like the day had kept its promise. In the shade of the forecourt, accounts spread across a low table, while a vizier's deputy watched the tallies with a face trained to betray nothing. Wages had been marked by jars and loaves, and fairness had been written not only into totals but into sequence, because order relied as much on timing as on weight. An appeal was heard regarding a brother who had avoided his crew for a week to tend a sick child, and the scribe asked for witnesses before changing a record. The steward set aside a note to the village headman regarding the state of the path at the ridge, and another to the keeper of the storeroom about replacing 2 broken baskets. Memory did not stand alone, it walked with ink and record, and those records allowed the village to sleep without counting debts on fingers. A boy returned the signet to its box after an inventory, careful hands and careful eyes together, because names on clay were not to be taken lightly. The shade felt cool across cheeks where the breeze threaded the portico, a small mercy that held attention steady while rows and columns tightened their grip. With lists checked and queries placed, the deputy dipped his head and stepped away. Evenings returned tasks to quiet hands, and a household's peace made room for small repairs and thoughts too modest for daytime speech. A carver revisited a fault from years past and decided to leave it be because acceptance strengthened the next decision more than stubborn pride. On a bench near the lane, an elder told how a mistracked sledge had once cut a groove that later became a useful drain, and the listeners nodded because use gave shape to stories. The shrine's small cap sat under linen, waiting until the priest agreed that its shine would meet the sun honestly, and an apprentice guarded the doorway as if warding off chance. In private, a simple prayer for steadiness found its way into the same few words, practiced not as a plea, but as a habit that leaned on duty. Garden beds edged the houses and took their share from the day, and a jug of water stood ready for morning before the bellies of jars thinned. Over these small matters, authority kept its distance and trusted the village to know its work as well as its debts. Along the river road below the ridge, the Nile gave a slow, patient slap against a moored hull, a quiet cadence that eased decisions into tomorrow's path. The night made no argument and needed none. Chapter 4. Ambush on the Delta. Delta waters forked into patient channels, and the plan had been set in the quiet days of watching charts and reeds. Decoy ships drifted where raiders liked to nose at trade, their decks stacked with jars and corded bales, and beneath cover, men waited with cords, hooks, and orders in the memory of the tongue. Archers had been placed in ranks along the reed banks, knees pressed into the mud on woven mats, each captain counting time in the mind, each scribe noting where a sand spit narrowed the stream. A signal mast waited on a barge drawn near the mid-current, and beyond, the command pavilion rode at anchor with a small guard and a scribe who tracked the movement of sails like reckonings on a ledger. The enemy had been studied: round shields, horned helms, loud boasting about easy Nile riches, their paddles quick in pursuit of bait. No fanfare announced the hour, only the quiet labor of steersmen holding position and the patience of men who trusted the trap. The decoys had canvas furled to seem unprepared, a cluster that promised clumsy freighters ripe for the taking, while the true escort lay masked in the reed shadow with oars shipped and bowstrings waxed. The waiting felt stretched, simple as work in a field before harvest, and only the soft slap of water against hulls marked the passing of the moment. The first Sheridan craft crept in with spear points visible above shield rims, their paddles pulling short and eager, and the feigned freighters let drift, crewmen showing backs and bent heads at the rail. The standard rose with no flourish, a square of color lifted on the river like a banker's seal accepting an account, and across the banks captains lifted hands to repeat it. On the decoys, hidden oars bit, slewing hulls to give space, and from the reed beds the forward ranks stood to half height by sections, each archer stepping to the edge, each string held in discipline. The line did not fire early, the count had weight, and the measure held until the leading paddlers had reached the mark, cut in the memory of a dead tree on the far shore. Then the order passed, and the first storm of shafts went up in practiced arcs from the composite bow. Not hurried, not wild, but like a practiced scribe's hand turning a page to the next task. Under that first flight, the decoys opened their side screens, and marines showed shields that would hold a narrow lane while the river did the rest. Sun or rank meant little in the ambush. Formation and timing decided the work, and sight of the raised pennant carried assurance across the water. The Sheridan turned with hard vigor, their prows slewing as helmsmen shouted for speed, and some drove in regardless, hoping to break through the false freighters and run down river with spoils. Grapnels were cast from the decoys, and from concealed barges pushed out from the reeds, the iron hooks grinding along planks until teeth bit and lines drew tight. Oars on the wings backed water to close the net, and the current itself pressed raiders into angles where turning grew costly. Along the bank a second volley rose on the captain's call, arrows seeking open spaces in shields and the narrow gaps around helms, the aim chosen by men who knew where an elbow lifted to stroke a paddle. On the freighters, boarding screens were pulled down to make a little fighting square, and command runners moved men to cover gaps with the calm of habit. No need for cries beyond the short words that told a file to hold. The river had no mercy, yet the trap gave order to its rush and took that power into ranks that had sat steady until the mark arrived. Through the tension, the deck beneath the bait ships trembled in tiny pulses as grapnels seized and lines went taut. Close quarter work began at once, when the nearest raider thumped alongside and its foredeck toppled across the freighter's rail. In that narrow space, a marine officer counted pairs into the breach, shields first, then blades, shoulders tight to keep a lane from collapsing. On the flanking barges, boatmen pushed in with poles to press another hull against the trap so that room to swing a long sword shrank to a laborer's width. From the archers, shafts now fell by sections wherever a Sheridan raised a shield to command a rush. The spacing adjusted like the steady turn of a balance scale. The Marines held to drilled edges and used the khopesh where a hook could reach behind a shield rim and end the push without wasted movement. Orders kept panic away, files relieved, water crews fed lines, and the rear ranks of archers crossed to new angles with deliberate steps. A scribe on the command barge marked positions on a narrow board while a herald repeated the count to the far bank so that fire did not strike friend. Across the boards and ropes, pitch warmed in seams where sun had worked over tar and hemp, and a faint resinous bite drifted from the caulking whenever a hull met strain. 2 booms had been dragged quietly the night before into a shallow channel, and now they were shoved out with poles to lock a downstream exit. The raiders who turned for that run found their paddles snared by floating timbers, and were eased sideways into a corner where a barge with a high prow waited like a patient gate. Commanders on shore did not shout glory. They adjusted rates and lanes so that pressure and release came in a rhythm. Men knew from drill. One bank shot in measured threes while the opposite re-knocked from quiet quivers, and in the tight space between barges, Marines planted shield edges to let javelins be handed forward. Decoys that had served their duty were pulled back to widen lanes for closing boats, and a reserve file crossed on planks to plug a sudden weakness where a raft of reeds yielded under weight. The fight was not short, it was kept from disorder. Each time a Sheridan leader tried to draw men into a wedge, a boat slid and blocked, or a rank took a knee and made a wall under which others could pass to cut cords. Throughout the encirclement, the steady thud of arrow hafts finding planking and leather marked time more surely than any drum. When the rush failed and oars grew confused, the raiders began to throw down shields and clutch at planks, and the commanders signaled to close on captives, not corpses. Lines were tossed with no roughness beyond necessity, and men were hauled to the barges in ordered pairs to be bound and set under guard. A herald on the bank walked the length of the archer ranks to halt fire, while crews with boat hooks pushed driftwood to the sides to clear the working water. Captains who had pressed too far were called back by name, and reserve files took stations on the outer ring to watch for any late thrust or desperate swimmer seeking the weeds. The counting of prisoners began at once. Not for trophy, but for record. Each knot tied had to match an entry. Chiefs among the Sheridan were moved to a separate hull for questioning about routes and companies. Their weapons kept aside for weighing and salvage. The work of quieting the field had a dull dignity after the rush of blows and turns. In the slowing light, the blue-marked forearms of the captured showed pale against new ropes as a clerk tallied them one by one. The river bore off the wounded craft in dignified drift while carpenters took stock, marking where a plank must be re-ribbed and where a seam must be redone. Barges linked to make a slow raft for the march upstream, and mess officers brought out jars and bread for crews who had kept formation without complaint. A court officer consulted with the admiral about which captives would be remanded for labor and which might be tried for service, because the crown had long made use of skill when skill bent to oath. What had looked like a flood of bold theft had been turned into a ledger of names and weights, and the Delta would know that commerce would pass again under protection. The decoys were congratulated for steady nerve and released to unloading, and runners left at once for garrisons on other channels to set the same order in place, where boats met marsh and sand. It was not a day for proclamation, only for notes and plans, and for the quiet agreements struck between rivermen who understood steady work. On the lips, a brackish tang lingered from spray caught during a turn near the booms. In reflection, the ambush felt less like battle, and more like irrigation done with rope and measure. Each length knotted to a purpose, and each sluice opened and closed on time. The raiders had chosen a place where many mouths flowed, and merchants drifted easy. The answer had been to shape a single mouth of will, and hold it until the task was complete. Later in halls, the vizier would ask for reports with the same calm interest brought to grain tallies, and the admiral would speak only of gaps to tighten and new reeds to cut for screens. A few of the captured would be judged fit for service, and a guard commander would note that strong hands found a place best when laws were clear and bread sufficient. The river knew no boast. and the king's presence on the command barge had meant steadiness, not a flourish. Order had been the weapon, and time the ally, with the strike directed where greed had crowded men into a corner shaped by pilots and poles. A scribe rolled his board and wiped the marks with a wetted thumb, while the barge turned toward the southern channel. In the westering light, the work lay finished, and the taste of decision settled as clean as a ledger closed. Chapter 5: Feast of Renewal. Opet had come in its measured season, and the city gathered to see the god on the move. The quays below Karnak filled as standards lined up, and the shrine-bearers checked their grips on the carrying poles, while grooms steadied teams and captains tallied the order of procession. After the ambush in the reeds, the river itself felt like a partner rather than a hazard, and the route to the southern temple waited with carved avenues and boat landings prepared. The obligation reached backward and forward at once. Ancestors were named in the mouth of the lector, and the fields yet to be planted depended on the favor now sought. Hands adjusted the linen of the mantle and settled the collar just so, as petitions bundled in cords were set aside to be answered on the way. The deep drumbeat from the quay thudded through the chest, a sign that the hour had turned and that the day would carry the image of a moon toward renewal. A comrade beside touched forehead to ground, and then rose, and the steward near the prow signaled the bearers to make ready. Authority did not shout here. It moved within rules older than memory, along a path the walls themselves described. When the great doors of the eastern court opened, the hierarchy stepped into the light in the order expected, and the water beyond waited like a long piece of polished metal to be cut by oars. Within the cool darkness of the sanctuary, rails and platforms had been wiped and the shrine had been tended until each joint sat true. The priests finished the purifications with steady hands, and the statue of Amun stood hidden beneath its veil, resting in the portable naos, whose gilded panels told stories no voice needed to read aloud. The lector counted through the words that had to be spoken, and then nodded to the carpenters to check the lashings on the poles. The offering tables stood piled with a show of good order, stacked loaves symbolic of the backlog in the granaries, jars sealed, and a few dates arranged in a pattern copied year after year. The vizier waited at the lintel to speak of petitioners who sought oracular response along the way, and the captain of the river guard detailed the watch on each landing. The work of a kingdom followed a festival, like shadow follows a figure. A faint ribbon of myrrh drifted from the brazier, a trace that clung to breath as the last knots were tied. When the time had come, the shrine was lifted, not with display but with practiced attention, and the men under the poles felt the familiar strain of duty shared evenly across shoulders. The way was not improvised. It had been walked by fathers and their fathers, and in that rhythm a burden became a path. The procession left the eastern court and descended between pylons, with banners steady and escorts careful of the curbs. Crowd and courtiers fell into the long corridor that the city understood instinctively, a narrow river of bodies that curved toward the quay or bent along the avenue. If the river ran shallow, the god rode behind curtains that kept gaze from the carved form, and yet presence, once proclaimed, made gaps in a sea of hands without command. Officials paced ahead to ensure the landing was clear, and a scribe at the elbow murmured the sequence of stations and stops, as if any of it could be forgotten. Royal steps matched the shrine's slow travel, and a standard-bearer ahead kept the pace by eye on a marker set in stone. Sunlight lay across the gilded cornice of the bark, turning an edge to a bright band that could be tracked as it moved. It had been said, in the private ways that served truth, that renewal was for king and god alike. The story on the walls told it straight, and the tally in the storehouses told it again differently. Neither contradicted the other, and the path carried both versions without a word. When the quay came open before the line, the bearers paused as the crew stood by, and final checks were made for the river passage. The bark slid to its carriage on the watercraft, and oarsmen stood ready to take the signal from the helmsman with the steering oars raised. The guard detail spread along the edges, ferrymen kept their spacing, and a second vessel held musicians and attendants with supplies stacked and counted. Across the quay, the order of march on land matched the order on the river, so that both bank and current could carry the guard as the day required. The road by the sphinxes took the overflow if need pressed. A hand rested on the cedar railing of the royal boat, the grain smooth beneath the palm where countless crossings had worn a path. A messenger arrived late with cables for a later stop, and the steward grimaced without heat. noting the delay by a scratch on a shard that marked all such small shifts. From bank to bank, faces followed the movement, and such attention had its use. The ears of the court learned as well as the recorders, and petitions gathered meaning as they were spoken aloud. Signals were made by cloth and staff, and the oars fell in as one unit without a shout, carried by training and habit. The river took the hull easily, bearing weight as if it had been built to do it. At the first landing, the rite mixed with the needs of a city. The granary overseers opened sealed rooms, and inspectors noted that the seals had been proper since the last count. Then foremen and scribes moved quickly to measure rations and issue what had been promised for the festival portion. Petitions were recited in brief as each group received its share, and the courtyards along the bank became both market and altar, the management of plenty shown in visible order. There was no haste in generosity, because haste lost track of measure. The vizier's aide walked aboard along the sacks, calming both givers and receivers with a practiced look that promised more days like this, and warned against the waste of this one. A platter set for the king held what would be taken in a token bite, and the ritual names were said that made such tasting stand for the whole. A piece of emmer bread came to the mouth, and its plain chew carried the promise of sufficiency in the season ahead. The steward set out for the next station at once, flanked by men who kept the narrow way open, and the shrine borne to the barge again did not wait long. By the time the shore closed behind, the lists were extended for another quarter of the city, and the crews already knew where the next stop would be. The oracles began along the middle reaches of the route, where the quays were wide enough to hold families and officials at once without crowding the carriers. Petitions were lifted to the poles beneath the shrine, and the bearers moved forward or back at the signals that shaped a judgment, a slight bow for assent, a lift and retreat for refusal, a patient stillness when the case felt too tangled for speed. Some asked for boundary stones to be replaced, some for a son's levy to be deferred until a field could be harvested, some for a quarrel to be ended by words rather than sticks. The chief lector kept the sequence and repeated the divine words that framed the decisions so that later no one could claim confusion. Your hand signed the copies, to be filed in the archives and posted at gates so that record might outlive argument. The chantresses stayed to the rhythm that kept minds steady, and the high metallic chatter of the sistrum marked each turning of the case like a hinge finding its notch. Order was a thing performed, not merely spoken, and in the measured sway of the shrine, the state showed itself in a form that could be carried. When the last petitioner stepped back, the steward nodded to the guards, and the river passage resumed as the sun marked off the hours. By the time the boats drew level with the southern temple, the day had gathered in layers, gifts borne, judgments made, supplies issued, and confidence renewed by the very act of being seen. The pylons there did not need to prove their purpose. The walls' reliefs told all who entered that renewal had always come and would come again if the pattern held. The image of the god was carried along the forecourt and into chambers that few entered at other times, and the sequence there was spare and precise, each element set in a place earned by centuries of repetition. The union of power and its source was named in terms the learned understood and the unlearned felt without need for the same words. Courtiers kept their distance, guards watched the distances, and the liturgy moved without stutter, a sign of competence as much as belief. In the gloom of the hypostyle, torchlight sprang and slid across carved scenes, a wavering glow that animated old stone for an hour. When the last formula ended, the bearers did not flag, and the chamber cleared at a sign from the priest who kept the key. Outside, officials tallied what remained to be given before sunset, and the captain of the river guard murmured about currents and moorings to his second as the boats made ready for the return. Evening brought the turn back toward the northern precinct, and with it the quieter labors that followed spectacle. The shrine floated again on its carrier, and the crews knew that the return legs ran straighter for tired arms because fewer stops sat between quays. Records were passed to runners who knew which court they should reach before dark, and the vizier's men carried the heavier bundles for archiving the next day. A messenger from the stables waited near the prow, with notes for the head charioteer, a reminder that horses did not rest simply because the city had made a feast. The king's animals learned the same rhythms of duty that the king did. In the aftercalm, where fewer eyes crowded every gesture, a thought could settle on what the myth affirmed and what the desks demanded. Both mattered, and the art lay in keeping them balanced. Along the palace forecourt, on return, The households matched pace to see the festivals closing, and those who had served all day took their place in the line to bow once more. A single flute far off let out a last thin note that thinned further as the procession turned within the gate. Lamps were lit in the usual sequence, and the image was restored to the sanctuary with a final correctness that set tomorrow's order in place. Chapter 6. The Field at Kadesh. Beyond the last palms, the Tell of Kadesh lifted from the plain like a knuckle, and the road narrowed between irrigation ditches where carts had bitten ruts into the earth. Columns had stretched long along the approach. The lead division marched well ahead, and the baggage train lagged with the slow cadence of oxen, while the guard detachment around the royal chariot kept a close ring. Reports taken at the outposts had said the northern king held his strength far to the east, and so the camp markers were set out near the bend of the river, and trenches were marked with short pegs where stakes would be driven. A scribe tucked a fresh roll under the arm and counted the wagons, and grooms walked the teams in tight circles to keep them ready. Harness was checked, axles were greased, and the command tent was planned to stand within a rectangle of shields. The driver adjusted the yoke and looked to the runners who would carry orders back along the road, and a captain took the roll of names for the first watch about the camp. The city's gates could be seen plain against the far slope, silent in the afternoon. The river ran dull brown beneath the ford. The blow fell not at the camp but on the road between columns, when dust rose behind the low ridge and heavy chariots burst across the flank of the lead division. The guard pivoted around the royal car, and the driver pulled the team into alignment, while the hand upon the bowcase found habit in its placement. The blue crown was set firm, the capreche bright with studs that meant rule more than show, and the decision turned quickly from march to fight. Confusion touched the carts and grooms, yet the chariotry kept discipline, wheeling into the intervals between marching files while runners hauled flags upright to give direction. A messenger slid beneath a loose rein and sprinted for the line of fresh dug trenches where the camp was only sketched. The team leaned into the traces, and the circle tightened as the first wave cut toward the baggage and sent pack animals scattering. Standards came toward the royal center from both sides, and the pace found a rhythm made of short commands and practiced turns. The rein leather rubbed at the palm. The nearest infantry steadied along the camp edge, shield to shield, and officers walked the fronts to make the tight square that set spears along four faces against the rush of wheels. Between the angles, open lanes were left for chariots to pass and return, and those lanes became the arteries of the royal counter. The lead division, scattered at first shock, gathered by 2s and 10s under their signs, closing toward the square's corners where the churn had not yet reached. There was no confusion in the signals from the guard. Pivot left, dress the line, hold the baggage gate, make space for the royal car. The driver lifted the yoke for a steady turn around the outer face of the square, and grooms pulled carts tight against the trench to deny gaps. Teams from the flank were watched for a moment when their speed would slacken coming off the ridge, and that slackening was the cue for a short charge and return. Runners brought word that stragglers were still on the road, and the shield line must hold the breach open for them to get in. War horns called in staggered notes. The second wave hammered nearer, and a ring of teams tried to break the corner where spearmen had not yet fully settled into place. The driver set the car at a slant to the square, and the archer stepped wide on the footboard to gain a measure of space for the draw, the body remembering how to use the waist to steer, while both hands worked the string. A flag went up at the camp's far side, where another knot of chariots attempted to cut the baggage from the line, and a small escort peeled away to keep that passage open with short runs. When the heavy cars crossed the loose ground by the trench, the wheels slowed and staggered, and that was the point for the practiced turn, loop, and sting, circling back toward the square. The team took the outer arc so the shots would land along the backs of those pressing the corner, and then slipped into the lane left open to pass through to the opposite face. Infantry, now fully braced, lowered spear points and worked their shields into a close weave that denied the gap. The dust baked the tongue. Pressure eased where the square held firm, and then tightened again where a path opened by a broken cart teased attack toward the rolls of spare gear. The driver spoke short to the team and took the lane, and the guards' chariots moved in pairs, leapfrogging the square's perimeter so that one pair always had a clear run while the other reset. Runners made a living wall for a moment to shepherd stragglers from the road into the safety of the inner ground, and the baggage crews pushed wagons across their own traces to form a rough barrier. The heavy cars that had swept around the flank earlier lost pace as they sought room near the camp edge, and suddenly the path narrowed to a tangle of poles and carts that blunted their speed. Flags shifted to show a wide rotation at the near corner, and the royal car took that swing hard to strike at the mast spokes, then angled away to give the infantry a clean line. In the center, scribes gathered casualty tallies on spare shards and stacked them in reed baskets for later record, keeping count even as the field turned. Horse sweat rose sharp. With the corner secured, short runs were made outward and back to punish the weight that still pressed around the edges, and the team soon kept a steady circle around the square so that the rhythm of shooting and returning could be maintained. There was no thought for long pursuit. Each run had its measure in the lanes and the square's faces, and each return had a fixed point where a glance could check that the rear was still firm. The bowstring worked as it had in training yards, and the draw found its anchor without wasting time, as the guard cars cut arcs that crossed and recrossed like a woven mat. The weapon earned in palace armories had both horn and sinew layered with glue, and the composite bow bent and released without strain while the driver kept the team ready for each sharp pull. Axles were checked by a quick glance at each pass, and the quiver slots were reached without looking, because the hands had done it enough that the counting came without conscious thought. Arrows traced thin lines through the near space. News came along the perimeter that allies had taken the east road toward the plain and now closed from that side, and a narrow passage opened for them to pass into the camp. The square held while a portion of the infantry extended the left face outward, turning it into a shallow rectangle that offered new lanes for the guard chariots to work. Heavy cars that had crowded too close to the camp had little room to wheel, and the ground cut by the trench stiffened their turn so that the next countercharge could hit their flanks and pull away before a spear could answer. A runner from the staff pointed the royal car toward the gap that had been used earlier, and the driver set the team to a quicker pace just long enough to let one more loop drive a wedge into the press. Then the royal car slipped back through the lane at the corner and returned to the rear face, where the spearmen had begun to step forward in short, exact intervals that kept the formation square as it moved. Wheels hammered the earth, the field steadied, then cleared. What had been a flowing circle of cars and a tight square of shields became a broad crescent as the infantry advanced by small ranks and the chariotry settled behind them to cover the flanks. No chase was ordered beyond the ground already fought over. There would be no break toward the river to scatter stragglers or overextend the guard. The camp was finished, where stakes had only been planned before, and the trench became a real boundary that made the interior safe for sorting the wounded and counting the lost. Grooms led the teams to water, and the quarters beyond the wagon line were set in order, with a place kept for offerings to be made in due course. Scribes wrote what the witnesses said, and officers compared their notes to fix the lines that would later be carved. In the long view, the field was held, not conquered, and the shape of the day showed that order and training had been the difference when surprise did its work. A faint breeze cooled the nape. Chapter 7. Walls of Dapur. Before dawn, the lines had formed below Dapur, a hill town nested in walls that climbed in bands, with towers set at intervals, and a gatehouse braced across the ascent. The engineers paced out angles with cords while scribes noted allotments of timber, basketed earth and leather. Companies took ground by markers planted in the slope, and the guard was stationed around the royal pavilion, where the standard angled in the breeze and the day's sequence of signals had been reviewed within a small circle. The town's terraces looked steep, but not impossible, and the ancients spoke of such walls as stubborn when the rock held. Sentries on the upper works kept their silhouettes small, and the path below the glacis had already been measured for the length of the ladder teams, the ram, and the shielded shelters. The plan moved forward along the usual route, masking fire, sapping at the foot, push at the gate, climb where gaps opened, hold fast, then pass the rest. It was a craft's pattern, framed by the habit of campaigns. The intention settled over the host, and the night's schedule turned to labor and watchfulness, while orders went out by runners to the foreman. The first light painted the upper stones pale gold. Sappers had been sent forward behind roofed shields, their shoulders bowed beneath planked coverings stitched with rawhide and reinforced by wicker screens, while suppressing archers watched the towers for sparks of movement. Files of bowmen worked in relief, pairs rising and settling behind mantlets as the crews at the foot of the walls leveled ground and cut shallow approaches with adzes. Signals guided the beats of release, so the covering arcs overlapped and the crews beneath the shelters could move without pause. The bows were checked with oil, reeds of arrows sorted, and the message of timing repeated, a creed of siege work gathered from older wars. A captain raised a painted baton when a tower's crenelle was watched thoroughly, and a knot of lancers waited to move if a sally pushed through the lower postern. Stones thrown from above were glanced off with the curved roofs, and the incline to the right flank was cleared of brush to deny fire. The bitter pitch smoke stung the nose as braziers in the town were fired to heat the defenders' pots. The ladders had gone up in files, each carried by pairs, with spare rungs slung on cords and pegs ready for quick repairs. A line of standard-bearers kept the alignment steady, and signallers with trumpets stood by the work chiefs to send each phase along the slope. The movement balanced between caution and pace, for a too-fast press at the wrong notch drew missiles like a magnet, yet stalling broke the rhythm of the crews and made the carry heavier. Each ladder team had its assigned window between towers, calculated to avoid the thicker showers from dead-ground angles the defenders knew well. Shield men paired with the carriers, holding curved covers to catch what fell as the steps were walked forward. A reserve stood in the second line, ready to take a ladder whose team had been scattered or to feed fresh hands to the front. The day's devices had been simplified after Kadesh, nothing wasteful, nothing untested, a clean sequence. When the nearest towers were suppressed by ordered fire, the ladders were heeled in and wedges bit into the slope to hold the feet. The long trumpets sent a low call across the ascent. At the gate, the ram had been slung on leather bands beneath a frame, ox hide stretched and dampened across the covering canopy, with crosspieces lashed to distribute the shock. Teams rotated the carry, then braced in the shelter and worked the beam in unison between hooks. The rhythm was counted aloud by a foreman, while the workmasters kept the bands tight and the lashings clear. A detail with axes held to one side watched for falling debris from the portal's lintel, and a small party with pry bars crouched behind. The gate doors had been iron-bossed and bound with dowels that could split if the blows found the seam, and a second team waited to set fire to broken boards if a channel opened for it. Runners kept the chain of orders clean, hold when a tower's arc stiffened, press when the covering fire leaned heavily on their parapets. The discipline felt like the same pulse that had carried the chariot divisions in earlier fields, but altered for wood and stone rather than wheels and teams. The ram's beam shuddered through hands on the frame. Where the ladders reached the stone, the first assault groups climbed with short blades and hooked tools, and a second set of men followed with wicker shields to hand up as steps were gained. The defenders tried to rock the ladders off their perches, and some fell back after the first scramble when a rung cracked or a rail split. Quick splices were made, and new ladders moved into their gaps. The press on the right flank held better ground, where the parapet was less carefully finished, and grips could bite between rough courses. There hooks found purchase, and a shoulder behind a shield made room for the next pair of hands. The plan avoided the central towers until covering fire weakened the angle, and then a surge would match the ram's tempo to make the defenders split their force. The same method had appeared in temple reliefs for predecessors, not as a boast but as a record of habit learned and kept. The curved edge of a khopesh flashed when a man cleared the coping and made a notch where more could gather. Dust lay thick enough to taste at the back of the throat. Crews with picks and baskets widened a shallow trench toward the base stones, working in alternating sets so the slope did not slough beneath the weight. A shielded shelter was inched along boards laid over brush to keep it from bogging in fill, and the overseers checked stakes that marked the angled approach to avoid the worst of the defenders' drop. Every phase tied into the next, as a loom pulled threads across the width of the day, mask the tower, move the shelter, cut the approach, heel in the ladders, set the ram, climb in step with the blows, hold where the footings gave, send reserves to the slice that opened first. A circle of guards clustered around the standard as the staff scribes marked the hours against the plan, column by column, and sent it back through the couriers to the rear so supplies met the pace. Behind the front, ox carts wheeled up to replace broken timber, and water skins were hauled by the quartermasters, who made the rising columns of men meet what they needed without waste. The red pennant on the pole over the rightward work fluttered in clean, deliberate arcs. A hinge split at last, and the outer door bowed. Soon after, a ladder gap widened, and men held a strip of the parapet, while the gate crews went to axes on the sprung wood. The defenders fell back by tiers toward the inner court and its higher ring of walls, pulling their ladders to frustrate pursuit. A measured pause, then a press forward in order. No rush, no scatter, hands to the next work, standards placed to hold what was taken. The inner gatehouse drew the focus. Masking fire shifted, and slingers were called in to feed more weight at the windows where defenders sought to stall the second push. Pair by pair, fresh crews moved up to relieve hands gone unsteady on the ladders, and the ram's beam was nudged along its tracks to a new bite. Flags aligned, and the next sequence built like steps laid in stone, until the outer court was held and the ring around the inner ward settled. The bronze gong in the courtyard boomed once from within. The final press came on schedule. Ladder teams now practiced in their grips and splices, gate crews steady in their cadence, and the line of archers faultless in the way they shifted their cover at each call. The pattern had been maintained, and so the town's defense was ground down toward its center, not by fury, but by a craft's weight. On the inner wall, a clutch of defenders tried a short sortie, but a reserve stepped in and pushed them back with shields well aligned, and the foot of the stair to the gatehouse was held by a company, detailed to anchor the turn. Once the doors showed strain, a parley began from the window of the higher chamber. The terms were ordinary in such a place. Lives spared, arms grounded, hostages surrendered, accounts to be rendered for garrison and tribute. The press was halted, and men were counted back from the works. The lines were dressed, and guards stood to enforce the taking with method not malice. The single steady peal of a signal drum carried on the air. Chapter 8, Treaty and Household. In the great audience hall, the long floor stretched from threshold to dais, and envoys stood with hands folded, while staff-bearers held a quiet line along the walls. The scribes had prepared the docket, and the court had been summoned, so the day moved according to fixed order. The embassy of Hatti approached at the signal, gifts borne in measured pace, and the interpreter stepped forward to render phrases in careful sequence. Clauses were recited, oaths were affirmed, and the record tablet lay at the center beside a plate worked by palace smiths. A steward presented it at the conclusion, and the formula for amity and mutual help was given twice, once in the language of the guests and once in the words of the house. It had been years of marching and weighing reports, yet this moment sought to fix the drift of borders with writing and sign. The presence of the room leaned toward the table as the signature marks began, each seal pressed with a practiced hand. When the final approval was offered, the chill of hammered silver from the treaty plate cooled the palm, and the room settled into its new arrangement as attendants lifted the record away. After the proclamations, the text was handled line by line, its pledges of aid, the return of fugitives, and the maintenance of good passage spoken with calm steadiness. 2 copies had been fashioned, one for the house and one to be carried east, so that memory and text would match across distance. Messages had already been sent to garrisons and river stations to ready lodging for messengers, and to mark the stations that would keep the road. Names were recited of guarantors, and borders were described by towns and waters, not to stir quarrel but to prevent it. An officer of the court demonstrated the manner of sealing and binding so that couriers would carry the text without alteration. It was the same practical rhythm that governed grain accounts, now placed before a wider horizon. In this work, the counterpart far away, Hattusili, would take up his own copy and set his seal, and the 2 houses would be held by a bond that could be displayed as proof. While the clauses were reviewed, the reed pen scraped softly across the papyrus as corrections were entered, and the fair copy reached its conclusion. The alliance did not end with writing. The next weeks shaped the tie into kinship, as palanquins and barges were prepared to receive a noble daughter with her retinue and dowry chests marked in order. The guest house within the women's domain was set with woven mats, linens, and new mirrors, and the supervisor of the palace rooms considered how tongues and customs would meet without friction. The lady entered beneath a canopy with composure, her attendants counting each chest, and the overseer of the harem received her with the right words and measured bows. Gifts were exchanged, not as payment but as signs, chariots tuned for display, ornaments and fabrics that had waited in storehouses for such a day. There were instructions for tutors, so that the new household member would learn the names of courtyards and the rhythm of petitions. and for translators to guide servants through commands and requests. Elders of the court spoke the phrases that joined blood and allegiance, and the genealogies were read so that each branch understood the placement of the new twig. During the welcome rites, a faint thread of perfumed oil lingered in the air, and the company dispersed in good order after the final nod had been exchanged. Household order absorbed the change with the same methods that steadied campaigns and feasts. Storehouse scribes tallied grain for extra rations, potters increased the count of jars, and linen wardens grouped garments by size and use. Lists were compiled for perfumes, cosmetics, and jewelry maintenance, and the captain of gates arranged the roster for new guards at the inner door. Bakers shaped more loaves, brewers increased the jars set to ferment, and butchers adjusted the allotment charts so that daily meals would arrive without gap. Loom rooms took on apprentices to meet the demand for fresh textiles, and the head of the treasury set aside metalwork for future festivals in which the new member would appear. Mothers of the palace taught the forms of address to younger companions, and tutors planned readings so that language would be bridged without embarrassment. It was not new, only a larger current joining the main channel, and the practice of note-taking and quiet correction kept it smooth. In the eating hall, when the first trays were lifted away and the talk grew low, a mild sweetness of beer lingered on the tongue, and the servants moved the cups aside. Evenings turned towards settled company. The court gathered in small groups rather than mass ranks, and stories from the northern road mingled with accounts from the marsh towns. A box of game pieces appeared on a table, and elders instructed a younger hand in the way moves closed a trap or opened a passage. Dancers crossed the space with controlled steps while attendants kept count of the time for each segment of entertainment, so that protocol kept balance. The royal children read aloud in pairs, one voice following the other, through verses chosen by the tutors to fit the new season, and an old courtier offered a scene from a tale of distant mountains that did not argue with the map. The treasury presented a modest display of gifts received, each item noted and stored, and the chamberlain adjusted the order of seats to reflect the new tie without displacing old service. There was calm in the routine, a collected steadiness that allowed talk to move without urgency. In the lamplight, a quiet shimmer played along the edges of gilded inlay, as bowls and bracelets caught and released the flame in small returns. The work of making peace into practice went on at the margins of the map. Riders met at way stations to exchange pouches, and captains at frontier posts sent reports of traders moving along the routes now held open by agreement. 2 envoys who had lingered at the river quay departed with letters describing new tariffs, and a steward noted the names of those who would be repatriated under the clause for fugitives. Artisans restarted shipments of copper and timber, and scribes registered tallies so that shortages would be caught before markets strained. A judge heard a petition about a caravan dispute and instructed both parties to appear again with bonds and witnesses, insisting that the new compact demanded fair transactions. It was not the roar of a charge, but the steady grind of keeping balance, and the palace rotated its officials through these tasks so that no one office should bend too far. At the northern gate, as messengers came and went with folded documents, the clatter of hooves on the paving stones marked the rhythm of distance being bridged without alarm. In quieter rooms, the households braided their ways. Tutors set lessons in both tongues, and scribes compared scripts, one working with reed and fiber, another with stylus and clay, so that the meanings traveled cleanly. Children practiced greetings for seasons to come, and an older prince reviewed instructions for embassies he would one day lead, asking for the titles that would honor guests correctly. The new princess learned the forms of tribute presentation used in this house, while her attendants taught hand signals and small customs that would ease daily motions among servants. Gifts from her homeland found places of regard beside long-kept heirlooms, and tables in the women's quarters mixed garments from both traditions without fuss. At a low table, 2 secretaries set a page beside a tablet and matched words line for line, rehearsing the letter that would acknowledge the safe arrival and the firming of kinship. It was work without noise, but it made a bridge that would hold during harvest strain or a dry year. As they cross-checked the columns, the smooth face of a damp clay tablet cooled the fingers that turned it. With borders settled and households joined, attention leaned toward duration. The architects reopened bundles of sketches that had waited through the urgency of campaigning, and surveyors looked again toward the western hills where silence carried the duty of the next great task. Craftsmen of stone began to propose carvings for corridors, and painters requested new pigments to refresh storerooms emptied by earlier projects. The steward of works placed names against duties, and the master of ceremonies planned the sequence by which foundations would be laid and thresholds named for life beyond office. It had been the habit of the throne to think past the next season, and so the gaze turned from treaties to the house that would receive the body and carry the titles through the long passage. A basket of ostraca appeared as designers tested proportions with quick sketches and numbers that would translate into chisels and tampers within rock. The household, calmed by peace, made room for this inward labor without neglecting the day's requests. When the party rode out to view the cliffs, a breath of shadow from the cut face of the hill lay cool across the cheek, and the work of the next chapter began to gather in mind. Chapter 9: House of Eternity. The path into the western valley bent between pale cliffs and led toward the hidden entry where crews had set a doorway with crisp edges and a lintel shaped for gravity's regard. The place had been picked for its quiet turns and its good stone, and the line of descent matched the old angles taught by master surveyors whose chords and weights seldom lied. A foreman with a shaved head and a careful tongue waited at the threshold while measures were exchanged in brief words, and rods were placed, and a scribe marked the change of slope from corridor to well shaft. A second chamber had been laid out for storage, and a third for the house of the body, and once the length had been checked against earlier notes, a signal went through the team so haulers and cutters moved in their rhythm again. The work had lasted over seasons, and would last longer still, and the confidence of repetition steadied hands that had learned this art on the tombs of fathers who lay nearby. In the light from a lamp, a hand steadied the wall as a line was traced and compared to a standard kept at the palace workshop, and a small correction settled the day's plan, as warm soot smeared across fingertips. Inside the passage, stonecutters widened the corridor by rule, not by hunch, and the flick of a foreman's wrist set teams to opposite faces so that cross-strokes balanced pressures. Sandstone veins asked for patience, the harder bars asked for weight, and wedges found seams as if speaking to them. A shaft had been started to catch debris and to hold a sentinel pit where thieves might stumble, and its mouth stood ready for a deeper bite when needed. Beyond, a niche for offerings took its share of the wall, and the spacing left room for a doorway with a guard lintel. A rough sketch on an ostracon guided the morning's adjustment, a quick hand drawing the turn of the corridor, and a figure laid at its end with arms close and crown high. The scribe of the tomb read the lines aloud and added a note in a margin about load and angle, and a foreman scratched across to show agreement. Then the hammers rose in turn and found their pattern, and the oversight rested in the small movements that kept tools honest, as a single tap carried down the shaft. Painters came after the wall had reached its proportion, and plasterers followed them with patient hands to smooth a field for the sacred words that named the hours. A meeting in the first chamber set the order, and the old sequence of the Amduat moved from lip to deeper places, hour by hour, bark by bark, so that the god and the company made their circle without crowding. Teams agreed on borders and registers, and signs were measured out with string. Then the figures were pricked and transferred where the wall carried the right firmness. The draftsman, senior among them, took the first pass with reed and fine lines, and apprentices set the lesser forms while a steward kept count of pots and chalk. The tale of night voyage had been told many times, but each wall required its own calm, and mistakes were not raised voices but patient scraping and starting again, until the line held true. In the deeper room, an official read the captions that would guard the body, and the painter nodded as the words were paced. As the binder's gum laid for the pigments brought a gentle sweet smell to the corridor. Work on the resting place for the body demanded the careful measure of 3 stones whose weight could undo careless planning. The quartzite chest had been ordered years before, and its lid carried a curve designed to shed burdens that might press from above, and men with cords, rollers, and rails had practiced the path on a slope outside, so that the final day would be ordinary. Inside, height and width ruled the talk, and the floor's slight fall toward the back promised drainage and confidence for the ages. In the antechamber, a trial frame copied the bulk of the chest so clearances could be tested before the real mass troubled the passage, and somewhere a sledge builder sharpened a chisel for a tiny correction at a runner. Overseers spoke about supports and the number of wooden beams needed during the lowering and which faces would carry slings so that no edge took a sudden bite. A second team argued over the final pivot into place, and a steward measured the grain stores for the crews, knowing that hunger upset more stones than weak hands. During a pause, a cup of water was lifted for a steady swallow, as fine dust from the last trimming rasped at the tongue. The lists of what would accompany the body grew in the hands of scribes who knew balance: cloth against ointment, bread against vessels, weapons against tokens of peace, a measure for each day beyond day. Woodworkers shaped chests sized to fit the passage, and bearers rehearsed turns through doorways designed to be closed forever in their wake. A dais for rites would be carried and then returned to the temple store, and 4 jars with their guarding lids stood ready to receive what the living must leave behind. In the entrance hall, an official from the house of priests walked through the order of words that must be spoken before sealing, and the ever-repeating matter of timing returned, since luck belonged to those who kept a calendar. A steward from the court inspected the textiles and counted bands, and a chief of guards learned where a seal would break if lifted twice. In a corner, a goldsmith compared his work to the king's earlier gifts to shrines, recalling weight and width with a sidelong glance at the scale as a low lamp flame wavered over gold leaf. Beyond the chambers, the valley had its own lore and ranks, and the overseer of the west kept his rosters of men and times, so that every night and every rest day had watchers who knew each turning in the paths. The schedule shifted as the river rose and fell, and the gate at the mouth of the valley served merchants and messengers when it stood open and stood still when ordered. Rations came from the storehouse by measured basket, and disputes over them came just as reliably, settled by a clerk who had seen too many arguments end in the same way. The work gangs rotated for family matters, births and buryings, and the ordinary weight of living that no palace decree could banish, and yet the tomb in the cliff brought them back on the named days. Emissaries from the palace came on foot, not in chariot, so that the matter appeared a task, not a pageant, and the artisans liked that better. Records traveled to the great house by bundle, and the return word came just in time, often enough to keep trust. At midday, the mark of hours fell on a wall and told crews to rest, as a slice of shade under the cliff gave a brief cool on the skin. There had been talk, always quiet, about secrecy and the last turning, and how a wall would be leaned against its place and then covered in finish, so well that no eager eye could tell stone from stone. The door blocks were measured with closeness, less for beauty than for silence in their fitted joints, and a ceiling plan drew on old practice where earth swallowed the line of a builder's hand. In the writing room, phrases for the living to utter later were chosen for steadiness and for their age, and the worn favorite words were shaped again so that the breath carrying them would not falter. Some wanted the guardians to be fierce, others preferred they be dignified and firm, and the scribe found the path between them, while a minor official practiced the gestures prescribed for one who entered with respect. The queen's steward sent a note about accompanying rites, and a priest replied with a day and a place, and the echoes of old ritual found new time in the calendar of the court. In a quiet interval after these arrangements, a line of text was tried on the fresh plaster by a careful hand, as the scratch of a reed on the wall kept a slow, dry rhythm. Toward evening, the passages took on a settled look that belonged to work well past its midpoint, and attention shifted from making voids in stone to preparing them to receive what they were made for. The floor of the last chamber had been dressed, the corners made square without pride, and pillars left where necessity asked for them, without claim to ornament. A favorite steward stepped lightly through to recall where the bier would turn, and how the carriers could set it down without strain, and the chief of the necropolis guards repeated the count of men for the outer paths. The painter returned to inspect the borders and the captions, promising to finish in order, not in haste, and the foreman listened to his schedule without arguing. Thinking turned inward, and a small circle around the main chamber became a place for measured breath, and a reflection came uncalled, that a house like this asked for patience from the builder, and patience from the one for whom it was made. The sense of allowance mattered more than grandeur, and the disguise of the door would be a kindness to the work itself, as much as to the one it sheltered, as the smooth chill of granite under the hand gave a clear final assurance. Chapter 10. After the crown. In old age, you sat beneath the pylons of the Ramesseum and remembered the first Sed festival, when courtyards filled and races circled markers to prove renewal. The stones had been raised to last beyond a name, and their faces still carried the scenes of chariots, boats, and offerings, all carved when the arm was young. Heirs stood near with tablets and formulas for saluting, while a chamberlain directed supplicants to benches and the guards leaned their spears at the rail. A temple singer practiced the set lines for the daily service, and an elder priest set the order of lamps with the patience of a farmer tying reeds. The palace had narrowed to a few rooms and a measured pace from doorway to hall, and the throne had become a chair with a cushion that eased the joints. Accounts arrived in small bundles and seals were pressed with care, but decisions now settled like silt, slow and certain. A dry west wind brushed the linen at the wrist. Names once learned in haste were recited for pleasure, from boat captains who brought cedar to the overseers who dug channels when the water ran high. Memory walked along the walls and paused at the speeches of youth, and yet the day flowed as plain duty, with petitions heard, minor cases assigned, and the storehouse opened for a widow leaving with grain. The manner of rule had become a craft taught at benches. The eldest son took his place beside the chair and repeated set phrases to greet envoys, while scribes traced the framework of judgments in neat columns. The chief minister shaped the docket so that quarrels over fields and inheritance passed first, for such disputes had a way of widening if ignored. Protocol remained, but it had softened at the edges. The salute that once froze courtyards now came as habit among familiar faces. Grain accounts, tax exemptions for temple gardens, quarrels of boatmen, all had their place in the order, and pupils learned to keep faces steady while listening. A secretary whispered the measure of rations to veterans, and noted which storehouse stood nearest to relief routes if the flood came short. No one argued with the principle that oaths had weight. A signet pressed in clay still held a man to his word. The scratch of a reed pen was the only sound when figures were copied and names aligned. Where myth said command leaped like fire from a crown, the reality in these rooms moved by repetition and patient hands. The air watched and mimicked the quiet economy of gestures, and the page whose hair was newly cut learned how a nod could dismiss a case. Beyond the halls, the household ran with the tempo of long habit. Looms thudded in the workrooms and baskets went out toward gardens, while a steward counted jars against lists from the previous week. The kitchen put out stews by the dozens for attendants and watchmen, and trays were sent to musicians who waited in their corner for calls that might come. Veterans of earlier years sat on benches with tools across their knees and offered instruction in the mending of harness and the tying of knots, the same knots that floated barges and bound bundles at harvest. Daughters took receipts for cloth and checked dye lots against the promise of the seller, and boys who had just gained their first sandals carried messages between courtyards, proud for the weight of a word. The smell of baking loaves rose from the ovens and moved through the porticos. Each corner had its order and small ruling, and the order held not by terror but by the habit that placed a cup and its saucer on the same spot each morning. When a tray broke, it was replaced. When a threshold wore, it was packed with new chips. Measured steps across familiar ground proved a kind of victory, as if the world were kept awake by repetition. Old rhythms of the land still demanded attention. Messengers returned with notes on the flood marks at upstream landing places, and on the state of the canals that fed the fields nearest the capital. Overseers reported where lines of men could be pulled for dredging, and how many days might be needed to push silt aside before seeds met soil. Boats under oars went between storehouses to shift grain, as claims were approved, and sealed sacks stood in pyramids that would be taken down row by row when rations were allotted. Relief work waited for the word when the waters ran high and then fell, and the word had to be shaped with a sense of distances and the time a barge might take between bends. Tenants who had served as militia in youth returned now as bailiffs and offered first-hand advice on which dikes could be raised with least trouble. The river shone like beaten metal in the late light. Work in the fields had to be matched with holidays, and the calendar on the wall, copied years ago, still guided the dispatch of tools and teams. A letter to a provincial palace could take longer than a season if barges were caught in tangled reeds, but patience remained the remedy that saved stores and goodwill alike. Memory of the northern marches came as a companion on quiet steps. In the armory, gear once readied for a hard ride lay wrapped, and saddles and wheels were oiled as a courtesy to the past. Stories of ambush and rally were told to grandsons not as boasts, but as diagrams of endurance, with hands marking the paths taken when ground was unknown. A chariot team in the training yard made slow circuits for drill, and the driver raised his hand to the chair where an elder watched, the gesture neither proud nor pleading, simply steady. Maps on plaster still showed river bends and clustered towns, though some names had faded under later notes. Patrols went out along roads where small thefts had a way of growing, and their return was noted in simple strokes, short, long, for the routine of a region. The taste of grit returned to the tongue at the mention of old marches. Orders reached the garrisons with provisions for common sense as much as force, for a gate opened at the right time kept peace better than a spear. Where a younger arm once counted victory by the day, an older mind counted it by seasons without famine or revolt. Preparations for departure had been made without haste. Craftsmen from the western wadi finished the last figures on the chamber walls and tested the hinges of the great stone lid that would one day be set. A master painter balanced the tones of night and the path across hours, and the doorway's lintel received the last clean rows of small birds, hawks, and seated men that said what needed saying. Attendants counted jars and cloth and measured oils, not as riches, but as the right supplies for a long road, commonly described and carefully amended by every generation. The steward shifted bundles of letters and laid them aside. Words that had once moved armies became gifts to a future reader. The stone lip felt cold under a resting palm. The small blue figures that promised labor where the arm would tire were arranged, and a chest of tools waited beside them, modest in number, adequate in intent. Young ones were led in to see, not to marvel, but to understand that a house was kept even underground, and that order did not end. A reed mat went down, so the elder could sit a time and look, and nothing more was asked of the visit than recognition. Ritual did its part with the steadiness of sunrise. Each morning, officiants opened the shrine and performed the words that bound day to day, then sealed it again until the next cycle, so that time itself seemed to rise and set in a room. Offerings crossed the threshold as if crossing seasons, and the thought behind them was plain. The world had to be refreshed by human hands to continue. Old doubts and old trust sat at the same table without quarrel, for long practice taught that both had place. When the calendar marked a festival, the people watched the procession pass through pylons and out toward the avenue where trees made a corridor. The rattle of bronze carried from the forecourt and marked the steady steps. Some remembered the first renewal celebrated, and their lips moved with the set phrases they had known since childhood, while new servants followed from a respectful distance and tried to match the pace. The elder in the chair let the page hold the cup, and knew that the cup would be placed back on the tray without a drop lost, for competence had been taught well. Ritual did not flatter, it steadied, as any dependable tool did. Letters came from the far south, and from the towns near the sea, and their concerns differed only in distance. A complaint about a boundary hedge in one place resembled a disagreement over boat space in another, and both were met with a formula that balanced memory and fairness. Stonecutters asked for a decision on a quarry line. Gardeners asked permission to move an irrigation trench. Guards asked whether to place patrols on one road or the next. Each reply had to fit the case exactly, as a key fits a lock, and sometimes delay provided the better answer, for delay allowed tempers to cool. A grandson bent over the reply board and sounded out what the mouth would say in court, and the hands that had held a bow for a lifetime rested where they lay, content that the teaching had taken hold. The afternoon widened and narrowed as messages found their places. The smell of fresh ink rose once and drifted away. The day ended without surprise, and the lack of surprise became a grace, for it meant that the machine of care had run soundly through its long turn. Peace did not come from accident. It was built and maintained like a wall that kept out not enemies but neglect. And so, our reign along the Nile draws to an end. The temples fall silent, the chariots rest, and the desert wind carries whispers of eternity. Until our next journey together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.